who is going to start off our event today. Well, talking about issues that are bigger than all of us and transcend politics. One of these is electricity generation. No one wants blackouts. We all like to turn on the lights and get light. We like to have air conditioning in the summer. We like to have heating in the winter. And our demand for energy is growing. It's growing so much that all the solar and wind that we've been layering on the grid is not going to be able to supply what we need. And the North American Electricity Reliability Council has warned about blackouts here in the United States, like the one that occurred in Spain in May that shut down the whole Iberian Peninsula. Well, what we're going to do today is look at some solutions. How can we bring our grid back to what we need? How can we give everybody the electricity that we need? These new data centers, AI, we need electricity for everybody. And fortunately, we have a practically infinite supply of natural gas under our feet. And we have a lot of other resources too. And more important, we have technology and we have ingenuity. Well, I would first like to introduce Lou Puluresi. Lou and I worked together in the Reagan administration on the same floor of the old executive office building when he was with the National Security Council and I was with the Council of Economic Advisors. And no one knows energy like Lou does. He is president of EPRINC, the Energy Policy Research Foundation. And he's worked at the Department of Energy, other places in the government, and he has traveled all over the world. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lou, who's going to speak for about 5 minutes. We're going to have a bit of Q&A, and then I'm going to bring up our other panelists.
Okay, thank you so much for those kind words. I'm going to just take us through a few slides, but if you can't remember anything out of this presentation, just remember that intermittent power is very expensive to manage, and that fixing this problem is not a problem with the feds only. You're going to have to deal with states, local public utility commissions. We're in a very deep hole, and we need to start working on it. Now, on our website, there's this small paper called Power Vision 2030. Many folks at Heritage have participated in our events under this project. And it's a process we have in place to look forward to how we address these problems in the power sector. And I'd also like these are the sort of basic objectives of you might say, goals of the Trump administration. But I would also like to point out there's a very interesting paper by, I think, Loyola et al., let's say, on what has happened and on our Power Vision, we reference it in our Power Vision 2030 paper. All this stuff's on our website. But I really recommend you take a look at it. They have some very interesting data on which parts of the country have expensive electricity and which ones do not. So we have this potential load growth coming our way. This is shows you some range of different forecasts. This is a remarkable development because historically load growth in the US has been flat or very modest. And now we're in a position, in order to get the benefits of the AI, we're going to have a lot more power. And we're going to have dispatchable 24/7 power. One of the things I'd like to point out on this chart, the IEA lifted its 2050 forecast on how much electricity we're going to need in 2050. And I want you to take a look at this very small number here. Oops, let me go back. Let me just go back here. Oh, no, there it is. You see here, that is the actual, you'll hear a lot of data all the time about how much solar and wind capacity has been installed. It's important to look at how much wind and solar is actually generating power. That's a more important number. And you can see here this 3950 terawatt hours. That was the total world generated capacity for wind and solar. And the total number that the IEA now estimates that we're going to have to expand is literally triple that amount. So I think we've spent almost $1 trillion on all these net zero projects, and the yield of that is quite low. The other question is, why should we fix this problem? It turns out AI is likely to be extremely valuable. Now, we don't really know how valuable it is. I mean, some people will just see their cat videos more quickly, but its potential to lift the productivity, to lift mankind, is just enormous. Medicine, engineering, everywhere. And we're going to post these slides, I'm sure. I think one way to kind of look at this thing, we have a chart of the week. Anybody who wants to get it, just let me know. We'll send them to you. If you look at what we call a tale of two states, one is Florida and one is California. And you can see here, if you go back 20 years ago, Florida and California's electricity prices were very close. The big difference between Florida and California is, as Florida backed out coal, was 24/7 dispatchable, they replaced it with natural gas, also 24/7 dispatchable. But California did something else. California, through a series of mandates and government directives, pushed the state towards enormous commitments and reliance on intermittent power. And this commitment and this kind of execution of intermittent power became extremely difficult to manage. It increased power prices in California, and it made it less reliable. I'm going to show you, this is from the all-in, always-on energy folks. They're very smart. They do a lot of interesting model of power systems. And this is the actual system cost. So this is the big thing. When you go out in the world, people say, well, wind and solar is cheap. It's so cheap we shouldn't meter it. But the question is, it is not the same product. 24/7 power is a different product than intermittent power. And the always-on energy folks did a estimate of what it was really going to cost New England per kilowatt hour to execute the plan they have on the books now. And you can see that offshore wind, solar, onshore wind come in at very, very high prices, $240, $357, $438 a kilowatt hour. So the answer going forward is to see a lot of dispatchable power. I'm going to just show you one more here. You know, PJM is we have these regional transmission organizations, right? And they are organizations that, regional organizations that move power between states, between jurisdictions. And they also have to decide who's in the queue. And one of the things I'd like you to see on this pick on this chart is, you can see what the queue is here in 2010, right? What the queue was, a lot of wind and solar, but and you can see what the queue was in 2023, but what did PJM actually go for? They went for dispatchable power. So the problem isn't that they aren't going for dispatchable power, they're just not getting enough of it. And that's one of the big hurdles we're going to hear about today. And then you can see here too, this is PJM selects its priority. PJM is the biggest regional transmission organization in the Northeast. It goes Pennsylvania, big chunks of the Midwest. And you can see here that capacity additions by technology type are combined cycle and uprates. That is, systems to make the operate more efficiently. Natural gas. Combined cycle is natural gas. So the regional transmission organizations have gotten the message. The reason we don't have Governor Shapiro wrote the head of RTO complaining about their high cost for their capacity, what we call capacity markets, for this resilient power. But the governors need to look in the mirror. They're the ones sitting on the permits, not the regional transmission office. And I think we'll leave it there.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lou. Now, can you tell us, let's give Lou a big hand. Lou, you've worked in so many administrations. Can you tell us just how we got to this problem? How is it that the greatest country in the world in terms of resources, and you have many times said that it's amazing that we are now an oil and natural gas net exporting country. How is it that we have got in this mess, that we cannot produce enough electricity to meet our needs, and we might be in danger of blackouts?
Right. I would say, in terms of the production of oil and gas, we're in pretty good shape.
But the electricity.
But the electricity
is a different problem. We have so much oil and gas. Why can't we just make it into electricity so that everybody has a lot of cheap, inexpensive energy, electricity?
One of the reasons is the states, particularly the states, became very enamored with something called renewable portfolio standards, that is mandates that you had to hit certain targets of renewable energy. In fact, over 20 years ago, the Tokyo Electric Power Company gave us their data. And they're, actually, the Japanese made scrubbers work before anybody else. They know how to do this stuff. And they said, we cannot find a way to keep power prices under control whenever the volume of intermittent power exceeds 30% of our grid. So I think it's a classic net zero problem. We got enamored by a certain target without consideration of cost or operational. And it sort of, commanded the whole intellectual thinking in the United States, particularly in the left.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lou. Let's give Lou a big hand. We're going to come back to you after our panel and see what other comments do you have. So you're going to sit over there and make sure you keep hold of your mic. I'd like to invite our panelists to come up. Well, welcome. I'm going to introduce you all individually, and then I'm going to ask you to say how you think we can solve this problem of generating enough electricity to meet our needs. We're going to start with Bernie McManey, who's a former Federal Energy Regulatory Commissioner and currently a partner at McGuire Woods. During his time on the commission, he published more than 1,700 orders on a wide range of issues. He participated in these. And before his appointment by the President and confirmation by the Senate as a commissioner, he has been in the US Department of Energy. And his insights are always just brilliant. So Bernie, let's start with you.
Well, thank you, and thank you everybody, and thank you for Heritage for having me. I need to say these are my personal opinions, not that of my employer or any of my clients. The challenge that we have, and as Lou was discussing, is not something that happened overnight. It's happened over time through a variety of policies. And I think Lou hit it right in the head that one of the major drivers has been state policies that have been pushing for a growing percentage of renewable generation, intermittent generation, that then forced investment towards that. And whether you were in a regional transmission organization or whether you were in a vertically integrated state, you had those state public policies. Layered on top of that, you had issues like tax credits for renewables that drove investment and made it economic to do that. And then you have practical problems on permitting reform and everything. So all these things have come together to really create a challenge on reliability. And NERC, as you mentioned, which is natural, which helps plan the reliability, or not plan, but identify reliability issues, and standards in the US have identified that. The US Department of Energy just released what they called the Resource Adequacy Report in July, which also identified a way to look at how much of the US is going to be short on power. And so the question is, and your point is, what do we do about it? Well, I think the first thing to be recognized is it's not going to be fixed overnight. As much as we need to fix it overnight, it's not going to be. It takes time to build power plants. It takes time to do regulatory change. But I do think that some of the things that we can be looking at as a nation, both at the states and at the federal level, is how to rearrange the system in a sense that get the investment that we need and to build what we need to build for the long term and for long-term growth. That is going to be changing, I think, these renewable portfolio standards and their 100% goals. I think it's going to be permitting reform so we can build the natural gas pipelines that we need, or that we can build other generation that we need. We're going to need the EPA to rethink, as they are under the Trump administration, a number of their environmental requirements. But we're also going to need to be looking at new technology as well. We've got small modular nuclear reactors are going to be in the mix. We actually have fusion, which may actually come in our lifetime, and maybe by the 2030s, which will transform all energy. But of course, that's time, that's money. But in order to get these changes, we're going to have to be focused right now. And the interconnection queue, I think, is something that's really interesting. What it is that there's only a limited number of transmission lines.
And can you just tell people what the interconnection queue is?
Sure. And so there's a limited number of transmission lines that move power around. But you have to connect your power plant into that transmission line. And that everybody can't just get into it at once. you need to be able to decide where you go in, how much power is going to be in there, and can the existing lines handle that power? And if not, you got to rebuild the power system, you got to build out. And this all takes some very complex physics, way beyond my lawyer math, and and it's very hard to do. And what you had is, particularly when you had so many renewables coming in because they were chasing tax credits, they would put in multiple requests trying to find where's the cheapest place to go in. And it would stack up the queue. And then they'd pull out, and then you'd have to rearrange the queue. And it just would take a long time, whereas in the quote unquote old days, 20 years ago, you'd have big power plants like coal, natural gas, or nuclear. You'd say, okay, we're going to build a power plant. We know we're going to push this much power on the grid, and we're going to need this much more of a build out. Instead, you're having lots of little pieces going in and out, and it's very hard to plan the grid and to do it. And then the costs are amazing as well. One of the things that when they talk about how cheap is a delivered electron or just an electron generated is maybe for wind or solar, they're not only counting not the backup power that's needed, but also the transmission that's needed. And there's been a lot of work by FERC, unfortunately, some of it to try and transfer more of those costs onto customers than onto those who are driving the need. So the other thing, and I'll end with this because I know I'm going long, is we need to make sure that the rules that are coming out of FERC are ones that are focused on, are we building the generation system and the grid as a whole for the benefit of the people, the customers that pay for it? And it's that all that delivered power. It can't just be for the benefit of the generators who want to get access to the grid, because that's a small piece that is not necessarily building the right generation, the right transmission for what the American people need. And so the focus of our grid needs to be back on what do the American people need. And I think if we get that focus, we'll start to make everything else come in line.
Exactly. We want all of us to have electricity, not just Microsoft, Facebook, and the other AI data generation centers. Well, let's move to Travis Kurvula, who works for one of the largest electricity producers in the United States, NRG. He joined NRG after a decade of work as a government regulator, and he works to ensure that energy markets continue to deliver value for electricity. So let's turn it over to you, Travis. Just tell us, what do you think needs to be done?
A lot, and I'll agree with a couple of Bernie's, and then I'll add a couple more to the mix. But it's nice to be here, Diana Heritage. Thank you as always for having me. So, I mean, just to add a little bit to Lou's diagnosis of kind of the problem, and just to be frank, the last couple of decades saw a very rapid retirement of coal and older gas units, and a replacement of them by renewables as well as by other more efficient gas. But net of net, you kind of held steady or even took a bit of a drop in overall installed capacity. And for the reasons that Lou pointed out, this might not have been a problem because demand was flagging on the system. We're sitting in a power market, as Lou said, PJM, that last recorded a record peak demand in 2006. So this has not been a growing market of electricity until now. And that's what's really the inflection point and is causing us to stop a little short here. And in an era of demand growth that suddenly emerges onto the scene, it takes a little while, to Bernie's point, to turn around that ship. And just to give a bit of a commercial point of view on this, you've got manufacturers of turbine equipment that works on natural gas to produce electricity. They were told in the last administration that there wouldn't really be a market for the goods that they were selling over the course of time. And now people are yelling at them to hasten up manufacturing. You've got labor also undersupplied relative to demand for the same reasons. There's now a new pickup in interest in vocations, but that's a long pipeline. You've got everyone, be they generators, manufacturers, everyday workers, worrying in the back of their mind whether the demand growth is going to amount to what projections of it are foretold to be, whether the next administration is going to tamp down on some of this again, whether what we're living through is a dot-com bubble. It doesn't seem like it, but it always doesn't seem like it at the time, and because we've lived through them before, people are cautious. A commercial remedy to this, an obvious one, would be to get long-term offtake agreements that provide stability to revenues, to give assurance to the power markets to enter into power generation projects that lead to demand for turbines, that lead to a labor workforce, But of course, data centers themselves, even though they're very well capitalized, are not willing to make billion-dollar financial commitments without a clear timeline on their part of when they get their demand side project, the data center itself, interconnected to the grid. And that finally leads to another player in the market, regulated utilities, who are in charge of interconnecting these large loads. They're quoting timelines that are sometimes even longer than it takes to get a new power plant online due to other equipment's shortcomings, like transformer equipment, where manufacturing is concentrated offshore and is often bespoke. And so you have a whole problem of a kind of supply and demand daisy chain that requires some remedies. And it will sort itself out given the amount of capital and interest that exists in this market. But to Bernie's point, it is going to take a little time. There are happily some solutions that government can do to make the markets, put them back to work in service of new power generation. And the first is just to resist what seem like convenient political interventions in the well-functioning of these markets. As scarcity has emerged on the system, prices for electric generating capacity have increased. And that's led to calls and, in fact, action by federal regulators and in the states for price caps and interventions in the market. Those interventions are not going to produce the price signals sufficient to guarantee new generation gets onto the grid. Price caps will produce scarcity, not remedy it. Even people who should know better, candidly, the market operator, PJM, one of their proposals simply says, well, we would remedy the supply and demand problem if we just don't require AI loads to be backed by capacity on the system. In other words, making them into kind of second-class citizens that would face power interruptions. But that's inconsistent with the AI data center business model, and also by removing that quantity of demand from a market that works on supply and demand fundamentals, you're basically assuring that the price will never provide a signal for new entry to actually back up a firmer standard of reliability. So there's a lot we could do. I fully agree with Bernie about these non-market barriers to interconnection. We're still operating fundamentally on the grid under this kind of gold rush era rules where the first power project in line has the first right to be interconnected. But that's created a bureaucratic snarl that it's been incredibly difficult to clear to prioritize those power plants that may actually have corresponding financial commitments from AI customers who want to directly pay for those upgrades. So we need to fix that as well.
Well, thank you very much, Travis. We're now going to move to Jack Spencer, Senior Research Fellow here at the Heritage Foundation and author of the best book on nuclear power that you've ever seen, called Nuclear Revolution. And he's going to talk to us about the role of nuclear power and all these small modular reactors that we keep hearing are going to come online and save us from the problems that we're having today. Jack, let me turn it over to you. What do you think about the role of nuclear in our current electricity problem?
It's a tough question.
Well,
Lou talked
that's
about
why we have you here to answer it.
Lou talked about politicians getting enamored and that causing problems. I fear that's precisely what we see happening with nuclear right now. Now, trust me, when it comes to being enamored by nuclear power, I am at the lead. I love nuclear power. And that's why when I look at what we need to do to get it to where it could be, to reach its potential, and this is going to sound glib, but it's what I think. And I'll go into more details in a moment. The first, most important thing we can do is keep government as far away from it as we possibly can. Nearly every decision, I would argue, that government has made around nuclear energy to try to promote it over the last couple of decades has not led to where we want it to be. The same underlying issues that artificially inflate prices, that make it cost more than it should, that make it more difficult to innovate than it should be, they all fail. And I would argue it's largely because we're enamored by it. We're enamored by it, we want government to help, we want it to pull it forward. But that's not how these things work, they never do. What government's role should be, the government's role should never be to pick winners and losers, even with something as awesome as nuclear power. Because the moment it does, you corrupt the markets, you corrupt the forces that will drive the innovation, that will drive the efficiency, that will allow nuclear to be where you want it to ultimately be, which is a sustainable, independent business. So, how do we do that? Well, luckily, as Dinah pointed out, I wrote a book about how I think we should do it. And I'll talk a little bit about it. Oh, and I can't answer your question, by the way, about what role SMRs will play, because I don't know. None of us know. That's the thing about the future. We can't predict it. So the government's role should not be to say we need X amount of reactors. It should be, we're going to set a stable regulatory environment. We could debate what that regulatory environment should look like, but a stable regulatory environment. And let engineers do what engineers do. Let financiers do what financiers do. Let people do what they know how to do. And politicians and bureaucrats, I'll tell you what they don't know how to do, which is build economically efficient, sustainable markets. So that's that. So what are some of the things that nuclear can do? I'm incredibly optimistic because I mentioned earlier that no one has done anything for whatever long. That's not really true, because recently President Trump issued a series of executive orders. And these executive orders, I think for the first time, give us the opportunity to revolutionize how nuclear energy is done. They are underlined by this notion that we have 70 years of operational experience in nuclear energy. And we should build on that. We should recognize that these things aren't dangerous magic machines. They're industrial facilities that produce electricity. Our nuclear industry knows how to operate them safely. These are all what we thought we knew about nuclear energy and the threats thereof 70 years ago have not turned out to be true. So we should have regulations that reflect all that. That's what these executive orders in total essentially allow us the opportunity to do. So some things that I think that, so let's assume that the executive orders are going to do things that they say they're going to do, like put pretty strict time limits on how much it takes to permit, to rethink how we regulate low-dose radiation, which is the most important thing, I would argue, we can do. But there's some other things beyond what's in the executive orders that I think could be, that could truly revolutionize how we do nuclear energy. I'll throw some out there. The executive orders talk about research reactors and first of a kind being done under a DOE rubric. I think that's a great idea, but we should expand on that notion. Imagine if I'm an entrepreneur or a firm or a big established company, I want to do a reactor, build a new one. I should have this regulatory process under DOE where I can go experiment, where I can go do this thing, build knowledge, whether it's on federal land or not, that I can finance it, I can go do it. It's not a mother may I situation. It's the way we used to do nuclear power. Go experiment, go do things. Do that under DOE, build the data set. Then we go to NRC. I think their role should largely just be, maybe just be, commercialization. Take what you do at DOE under that regulatory regime, go get it commercialized at NRC. So the NRC is not doing a billion different things. We don't need the NRC to do a billion different things. Let's allow the NRC to do one thing. Focus on commercializing this research that's been done under this other process. Now, the third part of it that is not addressed in the executive orders that I think we should think really strong about, or really think about. Let's expand the ability of the states to also engage in this regulatory process. Again, remember, these are not magic danger machines. They're industrial facilities. States regulate all sorts of industrial facilities, including things that are far more dangerous than nuclear power, by the way. Why can't states have a more active role in regulating the day-to-day operations of nuclear power plants? Get Washington out of it. There's precedent for that, by the way. Section 274B of the Atomic Energy Act creates a program where states can regulate some nuclear power. They did that in 1948. We have a lot of experience since then. And a lot of experience of the federal government not doing a great job of regulating nuclear energy for if what you're trying to get is an efficient, innovative, economically viable business. So let's think about a larger role that states can play. So imagine that ecosystem. You're doing your R&D here, build your knowledge. You do your commercial permit there, and then you do your day-to-day operations here. I think that is a different way of doing nuclear power that maybe will allow us to reach this potential we're talking about. Then there's one other really important thing that I want to talk about, and that's international collaboration. The United States for a long time was the most dominant player in commercial nuclear energy, but it hasn't been for a long time. There are a lot of people who want to build nuclear power plants. Russia and China are the most successful in exporting. When they export a nuclear power plant to these countries, they essentially have cemented a 100-year relationship with them. We need to be able to compete with that. And by compete, I mean economically compete, provide a better service. In order to do that, we need to work closely with our friends and allies to build a nuclear energy industry where we're offering not just a great reactor, but great waste management services, which, by the way, that's a whole other conversation, which the federal government has completely screwed up. We need to have fuel to fuel these reactors. But working with our friends and allies, each of whom have their own expertise. Together, we can put together teams, private teams, private firms who can go out and compete with the Russian and Chinese without the government saying, we're going to build this reactor or that. We need our firms to be the most efficient, the most innovative, the best. That's how we go out and compete, innovate, and the executive orders lay the foundation for that too. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Diana.
Okay, all right. Well, thanks so much, Jack. Now we're going to move on to Mario Loyola. But before Mario Loyola speaks, I just want to say I want to welcome our online audience of about 400 people who signed up. I don't know how many of you actually on, but if you have any questions, we're going to go to Q&A after Mario and after Lou. Just put them in the chat, and they will be conveyed to me on my little cell phone over here, and I will be able to ask them of our panelists. So let's move to Mario Loyola. Mario is a senior fellow in law, economics, and technology. He used to work for me at the Center for Energy, Climate, and Environment, but he had bigger ideas, and now he has a vast portfolio. He used to work in the first Trump administration on the Council of Environmental Quality. He's also worked in the Department of Defense. And even better, he's a professor of environmental law at Florida International University. So he really knows what he's talking about. Mario.
Thank you. Well, or at least I try to play someone who knows what they're talking about on TV, which is the real professional specialty of people in Washington, D.C., by the way. So thank you, Diana, and thank you all for coming. Thanks to my fellow panelists for coming. I just want to say that this is, I think that AI is, the greatest technological revolution since the invention of electricity. I'm a super optimist about its potential to democratize the means of production, of economic production in a way that we've never seen before, but it takes a lot of electricity. It requires a lot of electricity. A Google search that's powered by AI consumes, 10, 50, 100 times more electricity than a simple Google search. And that's why you're seeing suddenly out of nowhere, in a country that hasn't seen any load growth, any growth in demand for electricity in 20 years, suddenly demand forecasts are skyrocketing. 25% according to the International Energy Agency, 25% here in the United States just by 2030. And what's really alarming is that nobody really has a theory right now of how all this electricity is actually going to be supplied to this, the data center boom that we're seeing around the country. And so we're starting to see in proposals like Travis mentioned, the PJM has a proposal for non-capacity backed load, they call it. They basically say, okay, you can build a data center, but unless you come with your own power plant, you need to be prepared to be taken offline during times of peak demand. It's not PJM's fault, by the way. PJM's between a rock and a hard place. But that proposal coming from the nation's biggest grid operator is very alarming, because what it means is that we're headed towards a period of constrained demand, right? And constrained demand is a guarantee. It's not a solution for scarcity, it's a guarantee of scarcity, right? I mean, as any Venezuelan refugee can tell you. So we're seeing now increasingly people are saying, oh, prices are rising. They've risen 30%, 50% in some places since 2020. It's because we have all of this, new demand coming from AI. And I just want to point out, there used to be a subject very popular in the university course, very popular in the 80s and 90s, not sure how popular it is anymore, called Economics 101. And I just want to point something out that I learned from my brief study of Economics 101, which is that when you have soaring demand for electricity, that should not be bad news, right? Soaring demand for electricity is great news. It means that your industries are flourishing. It means that your technologies and your companies are flourishing. What makes it bad news is that there are artificial constraints on the ability of generation capacity to expand to meet all the new demand, right? And by the way, energy is a commodity whose supply should be elastic. I learned what that meant in college too. Elastic supply means that if demand grows, the supply grows also. But we're seeing that supply is not growing in the United States. It is growing on paper in nominal capacity because all of this solar that can produce maximum 500 megawatts or whatever at 1 p.m. in the day is getting added onto the grid. But how much electricity do we get out of this power plant on the coldest day of winter, which is the demand peak in many parts of the country? Could be zero, right? So the grid appears to be expanding, but in reality, in terms of projected available reliable power, it is contracting. And batteries, we're talking about hundreds of megawatts of power that we need to add to the grid. There were additions of 4 hundreds of gigawatts. There were additions of 4 gigawatts of battery last year. And I will point something else out here that's really alarming, which is that the power sources that we really need, the reliable, dispatchable, run 24/7, dial them up when you need them, dial them down when you don't need them, are natural gas, coal, nuclear power. Those are the plants that we need a lot more of. Given the demand signals and the demand forecast that we see right now and the price signals that we see, there should be hundreds of new power plants, coal, natural gas, and nuclear. There should be construction cranes going up all across this country building hundreds of new power plants in that category of power plants. Instead, what we saw last year was net retirements of 10 gigawatts, which is the equivalent of like 10 large nuclear plants retired from the grid last year. So what are the sources? So I think the goal should be, and what we've been proposing for months, is a whole of government effort to just clear the way for private sector investment, because it doesn't need $1 of government subsidy, by the way, private sector investment in a massive expansion of construction of the power sources that we actually need. Why is this investment not happening given the very powerful demand signals that we see? I would say that there's several layers of constraints here. The first one is the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies, right? Which were capped by the One Big Beautiful Bill starting in 2028. Projects have to break ground by next year if they want them. But for the moment, those subsidies, every day that those subsidies in place, the hole that our electricity grid is in gets deeper because those subsidies have totally killed investment in the power sources that we need. Why? One very simple reason. When solar gets dumped almost for free in the middle of the day on the electricity grid, your natural gas plant can't sell its power during that period of time, and so it can't recoup its capital and operating costs. Investors see this and they say, well, we can't recoup our capital and operating costs even with soaring demand forecasts, so we're not going to invest in this sector. The only thing that it makes sense to invest in the United States today is another solar plant, which is why you see the interconnection queue in Lou's third or fourth slide, where the entire interconnection queue, which is all the projects that are proposed to add power to the electricity grid, is like an entire terawatt, 1,000 nuclear plants worth of solar, right? Of solar power, right? Most of which is never going to get built, and if it did get built, it wouldn't solve the problem that we have. Right, so the first thing is we need to get off of the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies, but we also need to clear the way for investment in the power sector in the power sources that we actually need. For that, Department of Energy and FERC are going to have to reformulate their orders under which the new power markets were created in the 1990s, so that investments start to make sense. There are other things that we can go into. We'll be coming out with a report on all this soon. We're talking about this constantly. But the main thing is, and I think that the Trump administration is headed in this direction, but the country really needs a national commitment to clearing away the constraints on private investment in a massive capacity expansion in the electricity sector. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Mario. Lou, do you have anything in response or any comments you'd like to make? Please stand up if you'd like.
I'd like to say something about Jack's comments because I think he's on to something on the nuclear side. Because I recently visited Japan and Korea to talk about this very issue because they have certain pieces of the nuclear supply chain where if we sort of re-engage in international trade a bit more, I think can be a big positive, both from the Korean and the Japanese. I think there's a lot of interest in that, and the question is, how do we engage all the different players to make that become, set up a system that's more realistic to bringing them in. And then the other thing is, I don't know what we do about the states. I think there's a change underway. For example, I understand Governor Newsom issued an order that they're going to have 2,000 new drilling permits per year for the next 10 years. And if you look what's going on in California, I don't know that we've really done enough to educate the public on why their power prices are so high. I mean, right now, we do have a communications issue because if you listen to a lot of pundits, they're saying, well, that's because the Trump administration is killing the wind and making them run the coal plants. But what's really going on is those coal plants, which probably were never made to be peakers, are being used as peaking units, very inefficient. But if you need to keep the grid operating, you're going to have to run them for a while till we sort of, like everyone said, it's going to take a long time, but the whole way we structure the production of electricity is going to have to go back to the way we used to do it.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lou. We have a lot of online questions, but I'd first like to see if there's any question from the audience, because you all came out through the pouring rain to actually sit here in person. So do we have any audience question? Right here in the front. If you could identify yourself and your organization and give us a brief question, not a comment.
Hi, I'm Jamie Tronis. I'm with the Center for North American Prosperity and Security, a project of the Canadian think tank, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Canada is really interested in expanding nuclear and being part of what you had called the allyship of energy here in the U.S. And Canada, as you know, has vast uranium deposits, some of the biggest uranium deposits in the world. How can you engage more with some of the allies like Canada on not just reinvigorating the American nuclear renaissance, but also, as you had mentioned briefly, in terms of helping with the problem of nuclear waste? Thank you.
Great question, and I know Jack refers to it as a nuclear revolution, not a nuclear renaissance, so let's give this question to Jack.
Yeah, we've already had a renaissance and it fizzled. Let's have a revolution. Look, Canada not only has a lot of uranium, but it has really good uranium, really high quality stuff. So, and we do a lot of work on that. But we need to do more, for sure. And not only for technology, but also just to build our supply chains, because in Alberta, there's a lot of demand for power in those oil sand fields and all that sort of thing. So I think a good model is one that we just in recent news, the US-UK Memorandum of Understanding, I thought was really positive. Sort of laying out what our objectives are and sort of freeing those two countries to move forward in a robust way. I like that. And I think something with the US and Canada, which we've done a little bit before in the past, but something robust like that I think is worthwhile. On nuclear waste, there's only one way to solve nuclear waste, and I might be the only one who thinks this. There's only one way to solve it, and that's to privatize it. So long as we leave the federal government in charge of nuclear waste management, it will be an abject failure. It needs to be privatized. The people who produce the waste need to be responsible for it. And if you look around the world, all of the systems that work at all, I err on the side of privatization. I think that is where you get the most efficiency and innovation. But where you actually get a fuel cycle that works, or waste management, the people who produce the waste are responsible for managing it. So I'm going to use a word that sounds pejorative, and usually I would use it that way. I'm just using it descriptive. In France, you have more of a socialist system, where the government owns both, and they have a system that's working. Here in the United States, we have the WIP facilities. That's defense waste and a defense repository. So in the Nordic countries, you have a private system. When you break that apart, when you have one party that produces the waste and a different one that's responsible for managing, it doesn't work. We need to privatize.
Okay, great answer. Let me take a question from online. Isn't more reliance on natural gas for dispatchable generation concerning in terms of price volatility and lack of diversity? Bernie, do you want to take that, or Travis?
Sure, we can probably both.
Yeah.
Actually, I think that's a very good point. Is one thing that I think is very important and that I learned when I used to help utilities deal with what's called integrated resource planning is you do want a diversity of resources to provide your power. One, you need different resources to serve the different parts of the load curve, but also you want to have a hedge against volatility. So not having all your eggs in one basket is actually, I think, a very prudent thing for long-term price stability, but also for long-term reliability. And so the issue isn't like we need one silver bullet, though fusion, if it ever happens, might actually be that. But before then, I do think it's wise. Natural gas is vitally important. It's making up 40% of our generation right now. With the price of natural gas, it's been, even as it's gone up recently, it's still down from its historic highs. But I do think it makes sense that you want to have you want to have coal, you want to have nuclear, you want to have natural gas, and even renewables can provide a value if they're deployed properly and if they're priced properly.
Any other member of the panel want to comment quickly, because we have a lot of questions?
Yeah. I just want to say on this point that if you compare, and we had a study on this towards the end of last year, if you compare the four largest states in the United States by population, which are California, Texas, New York, and Florida, one of those is not like the others in a couple of ways, right? California, New York, and Texas are swimming in natural energy resources, right? But the cheapest electricity is in Florida, which has no natural energy resources, and contrary to its name, actually is cloudy most of the year. So not even solar really works that well there. But the reason that it has such cheap electricity is that it gets 80% of its electricity from natural gas, which it doesn't produce on its own. Actually, it gets it from Texas. And so electricity is cheaper in Florida because of natural gas that it imports from Texas than it is in Texas, right? And so I would say that I totally believe in diversity. It would be great to have a diversity of coal and natural gas, but we can't have that because we have regulated coal to death. We have regulated that power sector there hasn't been a new coal plant permit issued in the United States in 20 years. We basically did to coal in the last 20 years what we did to nuclear at the end of the Carter administration, and now nobody's building either nuclear or coal. And so again, those are EPA regulations that just like the nuclear ones have passed safety well past the point of diminishing returns and to the point where nobody can build anything in the sector. That's the real problem, and that's why you're observing price volatility.
Great. Any question from the audience? Yes, over here in the back. Yeah.
Yep. Let's go to Russ. Yep.
Hi, Russ Green with the Prime Mover Institute. I have a question about nuclear. So it makes sense in theory that we've regulated nuclear to death and that the private sector is the way to go forward. But how would the panel sort of respond to the example of France, where they have a very regulated nuclear industry and most of it's publicly funded, as far as I understand? So they've almost gone in the opposite direction, and yet they've achieved pretty impressive results. I mean, not recently so much, but I think about 70% of their power still comes from nuclear.
How much did their Flamanville reactor cost? How much did their Flamanville reactor cost?
Nobody knows.
A lot. A lot.
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry.
No, sorry, go ahead.
So it depends on what your objective is. If your objective is to build a whole bunch of really expensive nuclear power plants, then the government funding it will be a great way to do that. That's not my objective. My objective for energy policy is to ensure that American families and businesses have access to affordable, reliable energy. Now, under that, I think that nuclear has the potential to provide that, and due to overregulation and subsidies, it has not even come close to meeting that potential. Now, I also allow that maybe nuclear is not the right answer. And if it's not, If it can't be economically sustainable, it should be allowed to fail. It's that threat of failure that drives progress. So that's how, I don't look at France as my model for most things, certainly not nuclear energy, though I understand your question. I think it's a good one.
So if I could jump in on that too, I almost hit the button
briefly.
faster than. I just want to say, so two quick things on that. First of all, you reminds me of a comment that one of my bosses at the Pentagon once said, that the French are irritating, but they're very capable. That's number one. The other thing is that, just because, China is a communist system, right? It owns, more than 50% of the capital stock of all the companies in the country. But if you look at it closely, it's actually much less heavily regulated than the United States is, right? And so it turns out that the really frightening thing about China is that these communists have figured out a system that is friendlier for capital, that is more hospitable for capitalist corporations to operate in than the United States, which I think is like some kind of dream that Bernie Sanders must have had this whole time, at least as far as the United States is concerned. And so I think that we have to, again, go, the United States is like capitalist in principle, but increasingly socialist in practice, whereas the Chinese are socialist in practice, the French are socialist in practice, but like in important ways, increasingly capitalist, in principle, increasingly capitalist in practice. And so I think that the focus again has to be on what is the investment decision? What is driving the decision to not invest in the power sources that we need here in the United States? Because you will find that the answer is absurd levels of overregulation, regulations written by people who have never been in the private sector and have no idea how people are actually supposed to operate under the regulations that they sit around devising all day long.
Okay, next question from the online audience. Is the panel concerned that the market could overreact to the anticipated demand for data centers, that we could experience a bubble like we saw when the internet stoked fears of a huge demand growth in the 1990s? Let's let Travis take that one. We have a lot of online questions.
Yeah, no, that's true. And if you look actually back to the prior era of a build-out when combined cycle gas turbines were sort of first conceived as a generating technology, there was an overbuild, and the manufacturers of that equipment and most of the power generators behind it went bankrupt. If you look back to the 1980s, there was a lot of optimism that in Lou's graph, load growth would continue to extend. It ended up flattening off for various reasons, and a bunch of regulated utilities they didn't go bankrupt, they just charged everything off to their captive consumers. And then we restructured the industry as a matter of public policy to have competitive generators wear the risk of this load forecast. So it is interesting, in different parts of the country, you do actually have public power models in some place, publicly owned utilities. In others, you have vertically integrated utility monopolies that tend to, kind of cause a lot of the risk for these load forecasts to be visited upon a captive group of customers. And then in still other parts of the country, you have more competitive markets for power where, in the case of where we're sitting right here, if the load forecast is wrong, it ends up being visited upon the shoulders of people like me and not necessarily a captive base of customers. But all of that has ramifications for the extent to which people are comfortable rapidly building out generation. That's why, going back to the point I made, it's so important for long-term off-take agreements to be formalized in this industry, because fundamentally that's going to be the thing that spurs capital formation. And anything we can do to get regulation out of the way of those forming needs to be at the very top of the priority list.
Yeah, and there were examples of A123 battery and Solyndra going bankrupt during the Obama administration because these were all subsidized companies.
Yep, that's right.
Anyone else in the panel want to add anything to that? Well, let's go to the, any other question here? Can we take a question here? Yes. Pardon?
For Mike McKenna.
Mike, of course. Please identify yourself, your organization, and ask a brief question without a comment.
My name is Mike McKenna. I'm organizationless at the moment. I'll make it very brief. I've heard the word overregulation at least 12 times, so I'm going to ask two very quick questions. Abolish NRC, yes or no? Abolish FERC, yes or no?
Okay, let's let Bernie take the FERC one, given there used to be a commissioner there.
I'll give a good lawyerly answer. Radically revise the Federal Power Act, which would effectively change FERC or get rid of it. And with the NRC, I think I like the idea of reforming it to focus on commercialization.
When you say abolish the NRC, Mr. McKenna, are you saying to abolish the entire infrastructure or the commission? Are you saying we need one person in charge, or are you suggesting, when you say abolish, you mean?
You know, where I'm from, abolish is pretty easy to understand.
Well, I'm curious.
I mean abolish, get rid of, dismiss,
the
destroy.
entire shebang.
Yes, go back and revisit the entire 1954 Act, the entire structure of the Atomic Energy Act. That's exactly what I mean.
I think it's an interesting exercise to consider.
Can I, yeah.
The next question follows up.
Mario,
go ahead.
Sorry. So I just wanted to say I would dispute your premise. I feel like I'm in testimony. I would dispute your premise. I'm going to answer the question I want to answer, not the one that you asked, which is that there's an alternative to abolish or not abolish, which is to just bring these independent commissions back within the executive branch where they belong, and that's what makes this FTC case that's coming to the Supreme Court very, very important, because there should be, as the great Ed Meese of the Heritage Foundation like to say, agencies are not quasi this or quasi that. None of these agencies should ever have been made independent of executive control. They're executive branch agencies, they exercise executive functions, and their leadership has to be within the president's removal power. And that would solve a very big problem, because then they could be brought within the administration policy of alleviating and solving the problem that we've been talking about this hour.
Well, there was a question online that follows up, and this is going to be our last question, because our events team is going to want me to close down in 3 minutes. But this question is, how aware is Congress of the demands for power due to AI, and what have they done to get rid of the regulations? What can the public do to pressure them to act faster?
They're very aware, as far as I can tell. I used to field meetings at Capitol Hill, and you'd come in and introduce yourself as a power company, and they'd be like, they'd address you like an oil and gas company, like drill, baby, drill. And these days, people are very aware of the power generating sector. In some ways, it's become kind of a bigger issue, if that's even possible, than oil and gas. What they've done about it, a little more limited, Diana. I mean, there has been a legislation in Congress that would put dispatchable generation at the very top of the interconnection queue, giving it priority onto the grid. That's a good place to start. Permitting is maybe not actually the problem here, the permitting of generation, but there are things you could do under the aegis of permitting to try to get resources onto the grid a lot faster, I think.
Well, maybe I can ask our other three panelists what they would want Congress to do about this problem if they could choose. Let's start with you, Bernie, and then go to Jack and Mario.
Well, like Travis said, they are aware of it, and they're searching for answers. And the problem in Washington is you kind of always go for what's floating out there, and without always having a full understanding of the problem. And I also agree with Travis. The United States is a patchwork of how we regulate and generate power and interconnect and do planning and everything. And the worst answer would be a one-size-fits-all solution, which is usually what Washington races towards. I actually am somebody who thinks that there's definitely reforms we need to do in terms of how the markets are structured, the regulated markets. I think we have to think about what, though, is don't constrain, the vertically integrated states in their ability to come up with solutions. Let new solutions come out of the regulated areas. But the bottom line is there's just a lot that has to happen. It's all very complex. A lot of it's driven by physics, and almost all of it's driven by money. And we got to figure that out. And then the political piece, especially from the states with their renewable portfolio standards, is an overlay that's going to be very hard to crack.
Quickly from Jack, and then Mario, and then we'll wrap it up.
Quickly, Congress has passed a number of bills over the last 3 years that have done a good job of making the current system for nuclear regulation better. My problem, though, is that my critique is that the current system's not going to bring about what I call the revolution that a lot of us would want, which would allow nuclear to reach the potential it needs. So my ask of Congress is to think more broadly about the sorts of reforms that Mike just brought up. I don't know if abolishing NRC is the right answer or not, but at least that's a legitimate question to ask and to endeavor, because it recognizes the underlying problem that the current system is, I think, fundamentally flawed. And so that we need Congress to not be so risk averse, to believe in the technology as much as they say, and to help us develop a modern approach that will allow nuclear to reach its potential.
Mario, last word to you.
Very, very quickly, the one thing I would want Congress to do is to stop talking to advocates for renewable subsidies. Just don't take any more meetings, pending further notice.
Or other subsidies, just to...
Well, I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank all our online audience. I'm really sorry I could not get to all of your questions. Next time we will allocate 90 minutes instead of 60 minutes to this event, and I hope we'll have other events in the future and that you all will come. Thank you very much. Let's give our panelists a big hand.